Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for another session in Picterra's Verify Sustainability Claims with GeoAI. Now, in this series, we've been exploring how geospatial AI and trusted data can be used to move sustainability claims from intention to something that's measurable and verifiable. So far, we've looked at topics such as deforestation-free sourcing and regenerative agriculture, and how GeoAI can support their implementation in practice. Today, we're focusing on biodiversity. Biodiversity is becoming a central part of sustainability reporting and risk management. But it's also one of the most complex areas to measure and verify consistently. Now, that's exactly why we wanted to have this conversation today. And I'm joined today by two great guests. Warwick Mostert is the Biodiversity and Business Lead at the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT, which many of you will know as a key source of authoritative global biodiversity data. And Julien Rebetez, CTO at Picterra, who leads how we turn datasets like IBATs into scalable operational analysis across land use and supply chains. Warwick, Julien, thanks both for being here today. Now,
thanks very much, Dan.
To get us started, I want to step back a bit and discuss why biodiversity verification has become such a big topic so quickly. So, Julien, I'm going to say goodbye to you just for a second, but we're going to bring you back a bit later. There we go, find the right button. Don't worry, he's coming back. So, Warwick, we've seen how carbon and deforestation has really dominated sustainability conversations for years, for a long time now. So why is biodiversity now moving so quickly to the center of both reporting expectations and business risk discussions?
Thanks, Dan. I think that's a very good question to start with. And we've certainly seen, as you've said, in the last couple of years, that the topic of biodiversity and probably nature more broadly has certainly become more and more prevalent, not only in a company's risk assessment, but certainly we've seen it now in the disclosure and reporting space. I think with the advent of the TNFD coming on, asking for companies to disclose on their dependencies, impacts, risks, as well as opportunities, has become, I think, a space where companies are now realizing how important biodiversity is, not only from a business perspective and the impacts on the business itself, but also more importantly around potential biodiversity opportunities in those landscapes in which they operate. And I think the important part as well is that these impacts are very dependent on the location. And I think that really is where we've seen the materiality of these issues relating to biodiversity and nature coming through.
Yeah, indeed, that local nature is something we hear about quite often, quite frequently. You know, carbon, as we mentioned previously, it has a number. Deforestation has a very clear signal, but biodiversity on its surface appears much more fragmented, much harder to quantify. And so, from your perspective and experience, you know, what's the biggest challenge that organizations are facing today when they try to move from the ambitions they have around biodiversity to actual measurements on the ground?
It's always been the question, is, you know, can we have one number for nature and for biodiversity? And unlike things like greenhouse gas, and carbon, there isn't. The reality is, biodiversity in its name is so diverse. So it's very difficult to try and justify having one number. And I think companies are starting to realize that. And I think another important element is that even measuring on biodiversity, the time that it takes to monitor and measure change is not immediate, and a mitigation effort and actions take a long time, and to measure that change over time is also very lengthy. So I think that's an element that is not necessarily difficult to measure, but in terms of getting that understanding across within a company is that it does take time. And then I guess another element is the sort of trust and the data that is available. How do we trust both internally and externally when we report on it, that the data that you're using and the reporting and the measurement is verified? That's really a key element that has come out.
Yeah, and the idea of the context, the idea of trust that you mentioned, having a shared reference point, really important in this. And biodiversity data on its own doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, but of course without it, it's impossible to make any sort of defensible decision. And that's where IBAT, plays a key role. So not just by making biodiversity data available as a start point, but by ensuring it's consistent, by ensuring it's validated, by ensuring it's usable across many different geographies across the world and many different use cases. So could you walk us through a bit more about how IBAT's role works in more detail, the type of data sets that organizations are using today?
So Dan, IBAT was created, I think, to solve a very practical problem. Organizations need access to credible biodiversity data. And the alliance partners behind IBAT are BirdLife International, Conservation International, the IUCN, as well as UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center. So those alliance partners in themselves, have extensive networks of scientists. They are the ones that curate these biodiversity data sets that IBAT effectively makes available on a commercial basis to users in order for them to base their decision on. So having that credibility behind the data sets through these alliance partners is really something that sets IBAT apart from other data providers. And it's the important element of that is that each one of these alliance partners updates these data sets regularly, and then making that available through to our customers is ensuring that they get the most up-to-date authoritative data in order for them to make those decisions on.
Okay, so when we talk about IBAT data, really we're often referring to lots of different kind of layers, and you've mentioned a few of them already, the organizations that you work with. But can you give us a bit more detail and maybe just a high-level overview of those data sets that typically organizations are using?
So there are a couple of core data sets that IBAT uses. The first and probably most widely used is the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas. That's an incredibly important one, and you've obviously got access to protected areas, World Heritage Sites, and others. Another important data set is the Key Biodiversity Area data set. Again, which really looks at, goes into a bit more in depth around ecosystems and the species that trigger the importance of those ecosystems. And then a very key one is coming from the IUCN, which is the IUCN Red List of Species. That's an extensive database which gets used, on multiple layers. And then there are a couple of derived data sets that are also on the platform. One that I think our users have seen and used quite recently is the STAR metric, or the Species Threat Abatement and Restoration metric. And the other one is the rarity weighted richness. So those are the derived layers that go into the other four core data sets that IBAT uses.
Right. And so I think an important point to mention now is that these data sets that you've mentioned, they don't automatically indicate whether an activity that's occurring is good or bad, but they provide this context.
You're absolutely right, Dan. So the context is important, and we really realize that it's a starting point. It's a screening of not only biodiversity risk, but it's getting an understanding where the local biodiversity value is. Ground truthing is incredibly important. So whilst you can do this high-level screening at a desktop level, it's very important that once that's given you the direction, you might have to bring in some local context. For example, different land use data. You've also got slightly different local regulations that might have an influence on that. And so to import, to understand the importance of those is aligning it with some of these other local and regional contexts, which is an incredibly important part. But it also makes it comparable across the different geographies in which companies have assets globally, and making sure that those are the same is very important.
Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, that distinction between the context and the ultimate conclusions is vital. So IBAT provides the biodiversity context, but organizations, they still need a way to apply that context across very large, very complex landscapes and indeed supply chains as well, to monitor exactly what's happening over time. So I think that's a good moment to bring Julien, who's been waiting in the wings, into the conversation. So thank you, Warwick. I'm just going to remove you for now, but you'll come back and bring in Julien. And we're going to look at how this context that we've been talking about with Warwick is really operationalized using GeoAI. So Julien, Warwick explained the role that IBAT plays in providing this trusted context. But from your perspective, the challenge usually starts when organizations have a very simple question. How do we actually use this data across hundreds, across thousands of sites and plots, and keep it up to date? Can you explain where Picterra fits in that picture?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that question really gets to the core of what we are doing at Picterra. So IBAT, as just explained, they provide the aggregated data and the biodiversity context. But I would say on its own, it's still mostly static information. And usually what organization and our customers struggle with is applying that context consistently across large areas, large supply chain, and then monitoring over time what's changing. And so that's really where we come into making this operational and feasible, basically. And so we integrate datasets such as IBAT one into workflows where we can combine satellite imagery, spatial analysis, and automated monitoring on top of these layers that we just discussed before. And so this allows organization to move from, let's say, a one-off assessment to a process that's repeatable and scalable.
Okay. And one example that our audience might be already familiar with is protected areas, particularly in the context of the EUDR. So could you walk us through maybe how IBAT's World Database on Protected Areas that Warwick mentioned earlier is actually used within Picterra?
Sure. So in Picterra Tracer, one of the tool where you can do EUDR analysis with Picterra, we use the World Database on Protected Area dataset as a reference layer to identify overlaps between supplier plots or operational areas and protected sites. And that's important for compliance use cases such as EUDR, where companies need to determine whether the location they are sourcing from potentially overlaps with protected area, in which case they might have to check on the legality of that area. But the key point is that I think this is not just a static map check, but once we have identified these overlaps, we can use our GeoAI platform and satellite imagery to monitor the land use evolution and change over time. We can detect disturbances to the protected areas. We can track activities and so on around those protected areas. So it really combines the underlying protected area layer with intelligence and monitoring over time, which means we can then turn it into a verification workflow, basically.
Okay, awesome. But that same logic you've just outlined there doesn't stop just at protected areas. So looking ahead, how does this extend to any sort of broader biodiversity monitoring beyond just a specific regulation like the EUDR?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the interesting thing is the principle is the same. So to us, it's we have a number of layers and then we can do analysis on them. And so you start with a trusted biodiversity context, such as the key biodiversity area, let's say, or some species related data sets. And then we can use remote sensing on top of that and GeoAI to understand what's happening on the ground on this location and could impact the biodiversity there. So beyond just protected areas, the same approach can be extended to other biodiversity relevant layers. So that might include intact forest landscapes, landscape connectivity, proximity to infrastructure, depending on the question and like the wider context of the organization or the customer. And I think the key point is that the system is designed to evolve. So it's not that we have a static set of analyses which always do exactly the same thing, but as reporting requirements and methodology change, we can really easily adapt the system and customize it to each organization's specific requirements. So to make sure the whole workflow is adapted to them. So for example, organization might want to track habitat loss or habitat fragmentation in biodiversity sensitive areas. And so we can combine those IBAT layers with satellite imagery derived indicators. And then you can monitor change consistently across very large areas and very large landscapes. And so what GeoAI really enables and Picterra really enables is scale and repeatability. Because instead of relying on, let's say, spot manual assessment, or like field checks from time to time, you can apply the same logic across thousands of sites across your whole supply chain and update it continuously as we have new satellite imagery becoming available.
So what I'm hearing, less about producing just a single biodiversity score, more about creating a system that links trusted data, spatial context, and ongoing monitoring as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as you discussed earlier, biodiversity is complex, and like it's not going to be just a single number capturing the biodiversity score or something. But so by combining authoritative datasets and scalable GeoAI workflows, organization can move towards more, let's say, transparent and more evidence-based reporting on their biodiversity impact. And I think that's what makes, at the end of the day, biodiversity verification feasible at scale.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Julien. So that sets up things nicely for the next part of our live. You know, we've talked about why biodiversity matters. We talked about the role of trusted data, how that data becomes operational. So I want to open up a bit more and discuss what this actually enables in practice. We've talked about some of these already, but where the biggest kind of ongoing challenges remain. So Warwick, I'll bring you back in for this discussion. Hello again. And we've discussed risk, we've discussed compliance extensively so far. So let's shift a bit more towards outcomes as well. So Warwick, to you, when organizations talk about becoming nature positive, what does that actually mean in practical terms from a biodiversity perspective?
Dan, I think you're right. The term nature positive has also become and is being widely used more recently, and I think it's more than a broad ambition. I think in practice it means understanding how ecosystems and species interact. I think if you think about it from a more practical sense, you have companies that make commitments around, for example, net positive impact or net gain, and those are very site-based commitments and site-based actions. Whereas nature positive, looks a lot more at the wider landscape. And understanding what a company can do to mitigate the risks and the threats to ecosystems and species in this wider landscape is a very important element of delivering nature positive outcomes. Recently at last year's IUCN Congress, they released and announced RHINO, the Rapid High Integrity Nature Positive Outcomes. And it uses elements that IBAT has within, around the STAR metric, looking at threats to species within the landscapes, so that companies can mitigate against those threats. In other words, the actions that can, take away some of the threats to particular species. And then over time, that monitoring can then deliver some of those positive outcomes as you see the threats reduce and the recovery to those species improve. So it's very much more a spatial context in terms of understanding what the biodiversity outcomes are.
Great, thank you, Warwick. And Julien, switching to you from that technology perspective, what needs to be in place for organizations to move beyond risk avoidance, start tracking these outcomes?
Yeah, so I think the first requirement is consistency and scalability, let's say, because if you want to track outcomes, you need to apply the same logic across all of your supply chain, all of your sites, and kind of update it regularly to make sure that the numbers are comparable and you can track the evolution over time. And so that's very hard to do manually if you have a large supply chain, for example, especially at scale. So that's one thing that's hard to do. I think the second requirement is integration, because biodiversity doesn't kind of sit in isolation. It's often linked to other like risks, for like deforestation risk or carbon stocks or water and land use change and so on. So it's just not just one single indicator that you want, but you kind of want to combine those indicators into a combined intelligence, and so you can treat them as a single thing to look at. And so I think GeoAI enables kind of continuous change monitoring using satellite imagery on top of the layers that we are discussing here, and then making a kind of a shared insights or shared understanding of what's going on the ground.
Okay, great, understood. Thanks, Julien. Next question to the both of you, and Warwick, we'll start with you first. What are the biggest barriers that you see to scaling biodiversity monitoring on a global scale?
I think probably an element down there is managing expectations. I think biodiversity data can certainly help inform decisions, but it doesn't necessarily remove uncertainty around it entirely. I think there's, again, as I was mentioning earlier, there is an element of time frame, and just in terms of how long it does take for some of the mitigation actions to see them come to fruition within these complex ecosystems and landscapes is critical. So getting that uncertainty and getting that understanding through at a company level, senior executive level, and from a reporting point of view is very important. I think another element is capacity. It's certainly not an area that companies have traditionally resourced. And I think this is an important part where partnerships and collaboration comes in. So if companies and entities themselves don't necessarily have the resources and capacity in this space, they do look to formalize partnerships and work on that collaboration around improving understanding of as you say, the barriers to some of this monitoring, and that's certainly where we're seeing this come through.
Okay, great, thank you. Julien, same question to you.
Yeah, so I think from a technology perspective, a major challenge is fragmentation, in the sense that there is a lot of data, but the data, the standards, the tool are often kind of developed in isolation. And I think here interoperability is key. And I mean, IBAT is doing a great work here, kind of aggregating data sets and making them available. Because at the end of the day, a platform like us, we need to work with trusted data and providers like IBAT to make sure our customers can rely on us to give trustworthy information, and that they can also adapt to as the framework change, as the expectation change, and so on. So that it's really very interesting for us to work with IBAT like partners.
And one thing that comes up more and more in these kind of discussions is the link between, of course, biodiversity and climate. So again, a question to you both. Do you see these becoming more integrated in how organizations are measuring and reporting impact generally?
Definitely, Dan. I mean, I think what's interesting, if you see a couple of the titles, and I think some of the role descriptions in companies, nature and climate comes up, and it's certainly coming up more and more than it ever did in the past. So biodiversity and climate are inextricably linked. To try and separate them is really, I guess, not an error, but it's something that really can lead to unintended consequences. The importance of ecosystems and the services that some of these ecosystems can deliver, particularly in an environment where we're seeing extreme weather events and the impacts from climate change having an impact on that broader landscape, is critical. And I think the understanding and that linkage between the two is critical. So absolutely, there is growing recognition that they should and they are considered together. Even if, as I said earlier, even if measuring them is different, the importance of looking at them together is absolutely critical.
Julien, same question.
Yeah, so I think from a technology or a platform perspective, it's already happening. That's what we are pushing for. So we don't want just to do protected area analysis or something like that, but we are really trying to combine this data with across multiple use cases. So for example, there is the biodiversity use case, obviously, but then if you have a deforestation use case, it's going to be tightly linked to the biodiversity question. So you want to look at biodiversity, deforestation, carbon, and so on, and report on all of them and take decisions based on what you're doing on all of these use cases, I think. And I think that, yeah, I think what changes between them, as was just mentioned, is how the data is interpreted. But at the end of the day, you want a global picture to take the best decisions.
Okay, great. So it's really not about finding that perfect metric that enables biodiversity verification. It's combining trusted data. It's combining scalable monitoring, and it's giving that crucial right context to make better decisions and to show real credible progress over time. So we're almost at time for the session, so I'm going to start to wrap things up. The conversation that we've had today, thank you, Warwick, thank you, Julien, really highlights that to verify biodiversity, it's fundamentally different from the sustainability topics. There's no single metric. There's no simple answer. So credible outcomes, as we've discussed, rely on those three things that we've mentioned: trusted data, scalable technology to apply the context consistently, and that key part, collaboration across organizations, across platforms, and across standards. And IBAT plays a critical role in providing a shared biodiversity foundation. GeoAI platforms like Picterra enable the transformation of that foundation into operational, repeatable, and a transparent system. So both of you, Warwick, Julien, thank you very much indeed for sharing your perspectives, for keeping the discussion grounded in that reality.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I should have mentioned right at the top of the call, for any questions, of course, you can ask them throughout this live session, and our team will be answering those as we go through. But please do put any comments, any questions via the platform of choice that you're watching us to today, and we'll get back to you. And for everyone who is watching and listening, we're going to continue this series with deeper dives into other use cases and methodologies, including how protected areas, biodiversity considerations can be embedded in everyday sustainability and sourcing decisions. So all that remains is to thank everyone again for joining us. Thanks to Warwick, thanks to Julien. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Bye for now.